In 1993, the UFC set its foundation with no weight classes or time limits. Fights ended simply when a fighter couldn't go on. It was raw, chaotic, and drew criticism for being too brutal. But that same organization is now valued at around $12 billion. Let's break down the pivotal moments that transformed the UFC from a controversial spectacle into a mainstream global powerhouse, starting with those wild early days. The origins of the UFC are rooted in a single bold idea: settle the age-old debate of which martial art reigns supreme. The first event in 1993, UFC 1, was more of an experiment than anything. The rules were almost non-existent. No weight classes, no time limits, no protective gear, and no judges. Only biting and eye gouging were banned. Everything else was allowed, and that made for a spectacle unlike anything fans had ever seen. This lack of regulation created a platform where anything could happen. In the first ever UFC fight, the 216-pound Gerard Gordeau delivered a kick to the 410-pound sumo wrestler Taylor Tooley's face, knocking out several teeth, a moment that instantly set the tone for just how graphic and unpredictable a UFC event could be. Royce Gracie, representing Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, instantly became the breakout star of the night. Smaller than most of his opponents, he relied on his family's ground fighting techniques to submit much larger and more physically imposing fighters. Gracie's dominance didn't just win him the tournament, it changed how people thought about martial arts. Suddenly, the effectiveness of grappling and submissions was front and center, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was viewed in an entirely new light in the world of combat sports. But as the UFC captured the attention of hardcore fight fans, the backlash started almost immediately. The extreme violence and lack of rules drew criticism from the public, the media, and politicians. Mainstream coverage was harsh, with headlines calling the UFC everything from a glorified brawl to outright barbaric. Many community leaders saw it as a threat, and debates raged about whether this was a legitimate sport or just a dangerous spectacle. Senator John McCain became the most vocal opponent, labeling the UFC human cockfighting and relentlessly trying to ban the sport altogether. Cable providers stopped airing events, and some states refused to sanction fights. The UFC found itself forced to hold events in small, less visible markets just to stay alive. Despite the criticism, there was something compelling about the early UFC. Fans were drawn to its unpredictability, the unique clashes of fighting styles, and the completely unscripted outcomes. For the first time, people saw that technique and strategy could overcome size and strength, and that made the fights appealing for anyone interested in combat sports. Still, the very chaos that made the UFC exciting also threatened its survival. The lack of structure brought attention, but also highlighted the need for reform. Fans wanted the action, but the general public and regulators demanded safety and legitimacy. By the late 1990s, the UFC was losing money fast, and its future looked bleak. The organization was at a crossroads: either change and adapt or fade away. In 2001, the UFC's future looked bleak. Pay-per-view numbers had collapsed, and the organization was losing money fast. Most investors saw a sinking ship, but Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta saw a chance to rebuild from the ground up. The Fertitta brothers, owners of Station Casinos and longtime fight fans, bought the UFC for $2 million and moved the company's headquarters to Las Vegas, a city known for combat sports. Lorenzo's experience on the Nevada State Athletic Commission gave them insight into what it would take to legitimize the sport. Then, in what would eventually become one of the single greatest decisions in all of professional sports, they hired Dana White, a former amateur boxer and fight promoter, as their company president to lead the charge to legitimizing the UFC. The first step in this process was to overhaul the rules and structure of the sport, and so came the Unified Rules of Mixed Martial Arts, which established guidelines that brought order and safety to the chaos. These rules established weight classes, required fighters to wear gloves, set time limits and round structures, and banned dangerous techniques like headbutts, groin strikes, and small joint manipulation. Weight classes alone made a huge difference. Fighters were matched against opponents of similar size, making bouts more competitive and safer. Time limits and rounds kept fights from dragging on endlessly, while the introduction of judges and a scoring system, borrowed from boxing, made outcomes clearer for fans and regulators. These changes helped the UFC shed its outlaw reputation and start to resemble a real sport. Securing regulatory approval became the next big objective. They began targeting key states, predominantly known for hosting major boxing events like Nevada, California, and New Jersey, and working closely with athletic commissions to demonstrate that the UFC was committed to fighter safety and fair competition. Approval in Nevada was especially important to host events in major venues in Las Vegas and acquire the credibility that came with being in the fight capital of the US. As more states signed on, pay-per-view providers began to return, and the UFC slowly regained its ability to reach a national audience. Even with these improvements, the turnaround didn't happen overnight. The UFC continued to lose money while the Fertitta brothers injected roughly $40 million into the business to keep it afloat. Pay-per-view sales remained underwhelming, and mainstream sponsors still hesitated. But the new leadership believed that if they stuck to their plan, they could eventually break through. Part of this strategy was to highlight the athletes themselves, believing that fans connected with stories, not just fights. Borrowing tactics from what built the foundation of sports organizations like the WWE, they began to promote fighters as personalities, highlighting backstories and welcoming rivalries that drew in both hardcore fans and newcomers. The UFC's marketing shifted toward emphasizing the athleticism, discipline, and drama, rather than just violence. The focus on safety, structure, and storytelling turned the UFC from a failing spectacle into a sport with real potential. The groundwork was laid, but the organization still needed something big to capture the public's attention and push the UFC to the next level. That breakthrough moment was just around the corner, a bold move that would test everything the new owners had built and determine whether the UFC could finally reach a wider audience. The UFC's turning point came in 2005 with the launch of The Ultimate Fighter, a reality TV series that would breathe new life into the UFC. The premise was simple. 16 up-and-coming fighters moved into a house, trained together, and competed in elimination bouts for a shot at a UFC contract. The cameras captured everything from daily routines to heated rivalries, giving viewers a chance to see the athletes' personalities and struggles. For the first time, fans could connect with fighters on a personal level, seeing them as more than just competitors in the cage. Getting the show on air was a challenge in itself. After every major network turned them down, Spike TV finally agreed to air The Ultimate Fighter when the UFC offered to cover the entire $10 million production budget themselves. This was a huge risk. The organization was already losing money, and this investment represented a significant gamble. If the show failed, there would be no financial cushion left. When The Ultimate Fighter premiered in January 2005, it quickly set itself apart from other reality shows. The format wasn't just about physical competition. It was about building anticipation for the fights and letting viewers experience the tension and drama that came with each elimination. Fighters like Chris Laban and Diego Sanchez stood out for their unique personalities, but the real hook was the promise of high-stakes matchups inside the Octagon. Everything built toward the season finale, a live event on Spike TV featuring Forrest Griffin versus Stephan Bonnar. This fight became the defining moment for both the show and the UFC itself. Over 3 rounds, Griffin and Bonnar delivered a non-stop back-and-forth battle that showcased every aspect of MMA: striking, grappling, and sheer determination. Both fighters pushed themselves to the limit, neither willing to give an inch. By the final bell, both men were battered and exhausted, but the crowd and viewers at home were captivated. The significance of the Griffin versus Bonnar fight can't be overstated. The bout averaged 1.3 million viewers, making it cable TV's first live MMA event to draw such numbers. The fight's raw intensity and the emotional investment viewers had developed in the fighters created a moment that felt bigger than any previous UFC event. Dana White later called it the fight that saved the sport, and it's easy to see why. After the final decision, both Griffin and Bonnar were awarded UFC contracts, a testament to how much the fight meant to the organization. The impact of The Ultimate Fighter was immediate. Pay-per-view sales surged, and the UFC's reputation began to shift. New fans tuned in, drawn by the personalities they'd followed on the show and the promise of more thrilling fights. The series also gave the UFC a way to consistently introduce new talent, turning unknown fighters into household names. Griffin, Bonnar, Sanchez, and Laban all became stars, and their stories brought a new dimension to the UFC's appeal. Beyond boosting ratings and revenue, The Ultimate Fighter helped legitimize MMA and demonstrate that fighters were skilled athletes with real stories, not just brawlers. As public perception improved, sponsors and networks that had previously avoided the UFC started to reconsider, and the door to new partnerships and opportunities was officially open. With its reputation rehabilitated and a new generation of fans on board, the UFC was ready to take the next step. The focus shifted from survival mode to expansion mode as they explored opportunities to become a global phenomenon. Instead of focusing only on its roots in North America, the UFC began looking for ways to reach fans in regions where mixed martial arts could find a foothold. One of the first steps was expanding its broadcast reach. To make this global vision a reality, the UFC targeted regions that could support live events and grow dedicated fan bases. Brazil was a natural choice, given its rich history in martial arts and the legacy of fighters like Royce Gracie. UFC 134 in Rio de Janeiro in 2011 marked a major milestone. The event filled the Jeunesse Arena and featured Brazilian stars like Anderson Silva, whose dominance helped boost both the sport's popularity and the UFC's credibility in South America. Brazil quickly became one of the UFC's core international markets. The push didn't stop there. In Canada, UFC 129 in Toronto drew a record-breaking 55,724 fans and a $12.1 million gate, showing just how much the sport had grown outside the US. In Australia, events in cities like Sydney and Melbourne consistently sold out, while Asia became another focus with events held in Japan, China, and Singapore. The UFC's approach in these regions included promoting local fighters to bring in a global fan base. The next monumental move in global expansion was the launch of UFC Fight Pass in 2013. This digital streaming service allowed fans to access live events and a growing library of past fights from anywhere in the world. Fight Pass made the UFC more accessible and helped build a global community, giving fans in countries without regular TV broadcasts a way to follow the action. By now, the UFC was partnering with major brands like Reebok, who standardized fighter uniforms and brought a level of professionalism, and ESPN, which cemented the UFC's reputation as a legitimate mainstream sport. Today, UFC programming airs in 165 countries, reaching over 1.1 billion households in more than 40 languages. This level of exposure was possible thanks to partnerships with over 60 global broadcast partners. The UFC's roster also became more diverse as the organization grew internationally. Fighters from around the world brought unique backgrounds, fighting styles, and fan bases. Anderson Silva's reign in the middleweight division made him a hero in Brazil and a worldwide superstar. Georges St-Pierre's success in Canada gave the UFC a foothold in a hockey-obsessed country. In Ireland, Conor McGregor's rise from local prospect to global superstar helped fuel a wave of new fans, both at home and abroad. Ronda Rousey did the same in the US and beyond, becoming a crossover star who brought women's MMA to the forefront and attracted new viewers to the sport. Financially, the results spoke for themselves. In the first 9 months of 2024, the UFC's revenue topped $1 billion, officially cementing itself as a global sports powerhouse. The organization's willingness to adapt created the very image that the UFC has become today. The next step in understanding the UFC's rise is to look at the athletes who transformed the organization by captivating worldwide audiences. From the earliest days of the UFC, a handful of fighters stood out for their skills and personalities that kept fans coming back for more. These stars didn't just win fights, they inspired audiences and gave fans someone to invest their support in. Royce Gracie's impact was immediate. When he entered UFC 1 in 1993, he represented the Gracie family and their Brazilian jiu-jitsu style, a grappling art that many American fight fans had never seen in action. Gracie submitted all 3 of his opponents in a single night, using leverage and technique to overcome bigger, stronger fighters in the no-weight class format. His calm approach and repeated success forced everyone in MMA to rethink what mattered most in a fight. Gracie's dominance didn't just win tournaments, it introduced Brazilian jiu-jitsu to the world and made ground fighting an essential part of the sport. Today, every top-level MMA athlete trains in this fighting technique as a direct result of Gracie's legacy. As the UFC evolved, Anderson Silva emerged as the face of a new generation. Nicknamed the Spider, Silva brought a level of striking skill that set him apart from his peers. He became middleweight champion in 2006 and defended his title 10 times, a record that still stands among the division's best. Silva's knockouts became highlight staples, especially his front kick finish of Vitor Belfort at UFC 126. What made Silva unique was his creativity. He mixed punches, kicks, knees, and unorthodox movement to keep opponents guessing. Fans tuned in not just to see if he would win, but to see how he would do it. Silva's performances brought in both hardcore fans and newcomers, proving that MMA could be as much about timing and precision as it was about power. While Silva was dominating the middleweights, Georges St-Pierre set the standard at welterweight. Known as GSP, St-Pierre built his reputation on being a complete fighter. He blended wrestling, striking, and tactical game plans to control fights from start to finish. Over his career, St-Pierre defended the welterweight title 9 times and later won the middleweight belt as well. His approach was methodical. He studied opponents, made adjustments, and rarely left openings. One of his most memorable performances came against BJ Penn in 2009, where GSP's skill and preparation were on full display. Outside the cage, his clean image and professionalism helped legitimize the UFC in places where MMA was still fighting for acceptance. St-Pierre became a hero in Canada and a respected figure worldwide, showing that discipline and intelligence could define a champion as much as athleticism. Ronda Rousey broke barriers in a different way. Before her arrival, women's MMA wasn't part of the UFC, and few believed it could become a mainstream draw. Rousey changed that almost overnight. She entered the UFC with an undefeated 12-0 record, finishing nearly every fight in the first round with her signature armbar. Her confidence and aggressive fighting style made her a must-watch athlete, and her presence paved the way for women's divisions in the promotion. Rousey's headline bout at UFC 193 in Melbourne brought over 56,000 fans to the stadium, a testament to her drawing power. Even after her loss to Holly Holm, Rousey's impact was clear. She opened doors for female fighters and helped the UFC reach a broader audience. Conor McGregor brought a new level of attention to the UFC, leveraging his brash personality and knockout power into a meteoric rise as a superstar. The Irish featherweight quickly became known for his trash talk, confidence, and ability to back up his words inside the octagon. McGregor's biggest achievements include a 13-second knockout of Jose Aldo at UFC 194, the fastest finish in a UFC title fight, and becoming the first fighter to hold 2 UFC titles at the same time after defeating Eddie Alvarez by second-round knockout at UFC 205. McGregor's fights consistently broke pay-per-view records, and his crossover boxing match with Floyd Mayweather gave the UFC unprecedented exposure. His ability to generate hype brought new fans to the sport and proved that star power could drive the UFC's growth. The legendary moments these fighters created gave the UFC stories that captured public interest. High-profile matchups like McGregor versus Khabib Nurmagomedov and Silva's title defenses became cultural talking points. The organization built on these narratives, showing that the UFC brought with it a collection of stories about determination, skill, and the pursuit of greatness. As the UFC's roster grew more diverse and its champions became household names, the organization's reach and influence expanded. Star fighters attracted sponsors, networks, and new fans, helping turn the UFC into a global entertainment brand. Their achievements set the stage for what came next, a series of business moves and partnerships that would take the UFC from a popular sport to a multi-billion-dollar powerhouse. Behind every thrilling UFC fight is a business machine that has reshaped the world of combat sports. The story of the business of the Octagon, deals, dollars, and dominance starts with a calculated risk in 2001 when Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta, with Dana White as president, acquired the UFC for just $2 million. One of the key drivers of this success has been its pay-per-view model, as the brand was built around blockbuster events where fans were willing to pay a premium. Big-name fights, like Conor McGregor versus Khabib Nurmagomedov in 2018, which generated over 2.4 million pay-per-view buys, ranking among the top in combat sports history. By 2022, UFC revenue hit $600 million from pay-per-view alone, making it the organization's largest single revenue stream. But pay-per-view wasn't the only source of income. The UFC steadily expanded its business model from live event ticket sales, global distribution partnerships, sponsorships, and merchandise. The Reebok partnership replaced a patchwork of individual fighter sponsors, streamlining the UFC's image and making the sport more appealing to major advertisers. Monster Energy, among others, became a fixture at events, with branding visible in the cage and during broadcasts. Broadcast rights have also been a game changer. After a $700 million 7-year deal with Fox, the UFC made an even bigger leap in 2019, with their whopping $1.5 billion 5-year deal with ESPN, which featured fights and highlights alongside coverage of the NFL and NBA. The ESPN deal also included ESPN Plus, a subscription streaming service that gave fans access to exclusive content and live events, adding another steady revenue stream. Today, the UFC works with over 50 international broadcast partners. The UFC's impact has also brought substantial economic benefits to cities hosting live events around the world. For example, UFC 287 in Miami generated $47.7 million in economic impact for the local area, supporting over 500 jobs and more than $20 million in wages and salaries. Each major event attracts fans, media, and attention that boost tourism and local business. While the money continued to pile up, a unique aspect of the UFC's financial model is its tight control over costs, especially fighter pay. While this has sparked debate, with fighters earning an estimated 18% of total revenue, lower than athletes in most major sports leagues, it has also allowed the UFC to maintain incredible profit margins and reinvest in growth. The most significant turning point for the business came in 2016, when the UFC was sold to WME-IMG, now Endeavor, for $4 billion. This was the largest acquisition of a sports property at the time and signaled just how valuable the UFC had become. The UFC's revenue topped $1.3 billion in 2023, and its current valuation sits at around $12 billion. That's roughly a 600,000% increase from the purchase price of $2 million. From controversial blood sport to mainstream global powerhouse, the UFC journey demonstrates how a combination of smart business decisions, bold partnerships, and relentless adaptation can turn a struggling organization into a global leader. But the story doesn't end here. There's plenty more to watch as the UFC shapes the next era of mixed martial arts. If you like what you saw, hit us with a like and subscribe, and join us as we unpack more across the world of the UFC.